Okay, well, we have a good showing here. Let's get started. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming along and attending this online session of a event put on jointly by the Faculty of Education at SFU and the Thomas Merton Society of Canada. We are very happy to be speaking with you, at least from where I am in Vancouver on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Coast Salish peoples, the Squamish and the Coast Salish peoples. We are a few of us here at the Faculty of Education. We informally call ourselves the Contemplative Studies Collective, and there are a few faculty members here who are interested in matters of contemplative education and contemplative inquiry, and there is also a program, a master's program at SFU about contemplative inquiry. And I'd like to introduce a few of the people who are involved in that program. We have Dr. Charles Scott.
Good morning. Good morning.
And Charles has been one of the supporters and organizers of this event. And we also have Dr. Hisun Bai. Good morning.
Good morning.
He's also one of the leaders of our program and also one of the great supporters of our collective. And I also want to recognize the organizers from the Thomas Merton Society of Canada who have been wonderful in helping organize this event, Judith Hardcastle and Dr. Michael Higgins and Susan as well, who has been helping with this event. So we're very happy to have all of you. And on the Thomas Merton Society of Canada side, I want to just mention a few things. First of all, the Thomas Merton Society of Canada and the Vancouver School of Theology's Merton Summer School course will run its course during the first week of July with Merton scholar Christine Beauchamp. And on the Thursday evening of that week, there will be a free TMSC VST annual lecture at 7 p.m. Pacific time by Christine Beauchamp. And if you want to register, please access the VST Summer School website. So for those of you who are interested. And today we have three wonderful speakers, and they're going to talk about the challenging times we face and how contemplative life can address these challenges. And of course, we are interested in how engaged forms of contemplation, as exemplified by the life of Thomas Merton, can provide insights to both how we understand these broad social challenges and how we can live and work through them. And today with us, we are very privileged to have Dr. Monica Weis. Dr. Weis is a professor emerita of English at Nazareth College in New York. Dr. Weis was a Fulbright visiting lecturer in American literature at the University of Pannonia in Hungary during the fall of 2011. She has served as the vice president and board member of the International Thomas Merton Society. And Dr. Weis is the author of multiple journal articles and 3 books on Thomas Merton. We also have Dr. Michael Higgins, who is the president of the Thomas Merton Society of Canada. Dr. Higgins is also the author of 4 books and numerous documentaries on Thomas Merton. And Dr. Higgins is also currently the president of Corpus Christi and St. Mark's Colleges at the University of British Columbia. Last but not least, we have Dr. Ajit Pyati, who is an associate professor in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at the University of Western Ontario. And Dr. Pyati is currently on sabbatical here in Vancouver, BC. We're very happy to have him with us here in our neighborhood for the course of this year.
Long time.
Now, I'll just give you a very quick outline of how this morning will unfold. I will be the moderator of this session. Each speaker will be given 15 minutes to speak on their respective topics, and I will keep track of time. When there is 1 minute left, I will send a message in the chat box, and I'll send it directly to the speakers. So if you have your chat box open for the speakers, you'll see a message from me when you hit the 14-minute mark. That will be an indication to wrap up. I will also hold up a sign like this to indicate that you have 1 minute left. And so I'm trying to reach you both ways, visually and via text. And so as each speaker is speaking, I invite the audience to send me your questions in the chat box. You can send the questions directly to me. You don't have to send it to everyone because there is that function in the chat box where you can send it directly to a person. And if you have a question that's directed specifically at a speaker, please indicate that in your question as well. I will collect all the questions. Now, after each speaker has had a chance to speak, there will be a brief period where the panelists will have a chance to interact with each other, where they can comment on each other's ideas and what each has presented. After the panelists have had a chance to interact, then we will open the forum up to the questions. And this is where I will take the questions that people have submitted and I can pose them to the speakers, either to all the speakers or to specific speakers. I will present them as indicated in the questions that you have sent to me. And depending on the number of questions we have, we may not get to all the questions, but I will do my best to try to pose all the questions. Okay, so without further ado, I will turn this over to Dr. Weis. Go ahead, Dr. Weis.
Thank you very much, and a special thanks to Judith for twisting my arm to participate today, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to try to share my screen right now and hope that that works. And David, give me some sense that you're seeing something. Yes, up, okay. And there's a corner of me showing, is there? Except that I'm not seeing it. Here it comes. You're seeing it still? Okay, then we can be off and going, I think, in a minute here, right there. My job today is to share something with you about Thomas Merton's widening vision and how his life of prayer may have something to say to us. And so I'm going to jump right into it and presume you know a little something about Merton's life. And I'm going to frame my comments in 4 sections: entering the monastery, how his prayer was shaped by nature, change that took place in his life, and how his habitat, his landscape, became a habit for his own life. So the first very piece is entering the monastery. Crash course in Merton's life. 1938, converted to Roman Catholicism, and December 10th, 1941, he entered the Abbey of Gethsemani, the Trappist monastery. But what's important about this is that he had a very traditional spiritual formation in liturgy and prayer. He would have chanted the divine office 6 times a day in Latin, getting through all 150 Psalms every week. He read the fathers and the doctors of the church. He read 14th century mystics, Julian, Meister Eckhart, Hildegard, stretching his theology. And then we know in 1948, his famous autobiography, The 7-Story Mountain, which gives a very pre-Vatican II worldview and shares some of the candid struggles of his life. But I want to talk about the impact of nature on his prayer. Merton writes in his journals, very often about the impact of the foliage of the trees, the dark curtain of the woods, and how beautiful it was, and that it brought him, and I'm quoting now, deep peace. I looked at all of this in its great tranquility, with my soul and spirit quiet. For me, landscape seems to be important for contemplation. Anyway, I have no scruples about it. I think that's a very important phrase. No scruples about using landscape and nature as part of his prayer, his contemplation. This is the monk who learned Saint Bernard of Clairvaux's wisdom, that you will find something more in woods than in books. Trees and stones will teach you that which you can never learn from masters. This is the monk who writes, every moment and every event in everyone's life on earth plants something in his soul. So this is very much a Merton event. So let's look at some of those events. June 29th was an important day in Merton's life. The abbot understood his desire to pray outdoors and gave Merton permission to go beyond the confines of the cloister and to roam the many, many, many acres of the Trappist monastery for his quiet time and contemplation. If you read through his journals, you will notice that that date starts an overflow of words about how beautiful things were outside. In fact, he gets rhapsodic about it for about 2.5 pages in his journal. And I want to share with you just one snippet of that when he says, first I stopped under an oak tree on top of the hill behind Nally's and sat there looking out at the wide sweep of the valley and the miles of flat woods over toward the straight line of the horizon where Rowan's Knob is. And here's an important line. As soon as I get away from people, the presence of God invades me. I love that verb, the presence of God invades me. If you read through Merton's journals, I found more than 1,400 references to nature in his reflections. And after that June 29th, many, many, many more references to nature. And I've divided them into 3 sections. Nature overflows into prayer. Sometimes when he's talking about prayer, he celebrates nature. And sometimes prayer and the celebration of nature merge. So I'd like to look just at those 3 moments or things that happen with his prayer and give you only one example of each, because I know our time is limited. So nature overflowing into prayer. Listen to what happens. First, he's celebrating nature, and then he gets serious about what the contemplation is doing to his inner spiritual life. And here it is. After night office, I stood in the door by the kitchen and looked at the stars and the sky paling out behind Rowan's Knob and the barns and the water tower. How fierce and efficient that tank makes this place look, geared for battle. And here comes the prayer. My God, lock me in your will, imprison me in your love and your wisdom, and draw me to yourself. I will belong to you. I will not be afraid of anything, for I shall remain in your hands and never leave you. So there's the celebration of landscape, which then merges into a prayer. How about the reverse? Prayer, which then goes into a celebration of nature. Merton has had a retreat day out in the woods, and in his journal, he's recording the fruits of that day, of recollection, of mulling over the book of Ecclesiasticus, and he writes down 6 points of spiritual insight, and then comes the shift. So I'm just going to share with you the shift. By the reading of scripture, I am so renewed that all nature seems renewed round me and with me. The sky seems to be more pure, a cooler blue, the trees a deeper green, The light is sharper on the outlines of the forest and the hills, and the whole world is charged with the glory of God, and I feel fire and music in the earth under my feet. A wonderful moment. But there's also when celebration of nature and contemplation merge together. Here's an example. Dawn at the Hermitage. I slept until 3 and came up here to say the office, the long way round by the road. Very thin end of a moon in the morning sky. Crows bothering an owl. Once again, the office is entirely different in its proper natural setting, out from under the fluorescent lights. There, lauds is torpor and vacuum. But here, it is harmony with all the singing birds under the bright sky. Everything you have on your lips is praising God there before you. The hills, dew, light, birds, growing things. Nothing in the liturgy of light is lost. I saw in the middle of the Benedicite the great presence of the sun that had just risen behind the cedars. And now under the pines, the sun has made a great golden basilica of fire and water. Next point, the great turning. I'm using Joanna Macy's phrase. She believes that all of us are involved right now in a great turning towards some ecological consciousness, but that's happened in Merton's life also. Those of you who know about the famous 4th and Walnut Street, when he was in Louisville, walking across an intersection, realizing he was not a monk, alone and isolated from the world, but he was related to all those humans walking across the street, that he was part of the great human race, one among men, as he says, and how exciting it was to be part of them. And if only he could tell them how they were shining like the sun. In the late 50s and 60s, the scholars of Merton talk about his turning toward the world, of a series of social justice essays like the Cold War letters, writing about the dangers of technology, the importance of civil rights for the Black community and indigenous people. And in January 12th, 1963, his letter to Rachel Carson. That previous year, in 1962, Silent Spring was published in the fall, and several months later, Merton had already gotten a copy of it and read it and written to Rachel Carson, and says several things. So you'll notice the widening vision happening here. He says, I love the nature that is all around me here, and I regret my own follies with DDT, which I have now totally renounced. So a sense of reform taking place, but also now a sense of that widening vision and responsibility. He continues to say to Rachel Carson in this letter, you are, perhaps without altogether realizing, contributing a most valuable and essential piece of evidence for the diagnosis of the ills of our civilization. We dare to use our titanic power in a way that threatens not only civilization, but life itself. And your book makes it clear to me that there is a consistent pattern running through everything that we do, through every aspect of our culture, our thought, our economy, our whole way of life. In order to survive, we instinctively destroy that on which our survival depends. A good quote that applies right to today. But here's his widening vision. He continues. The whole world itself, to religious thinkers, has always appeared as a transparent manifestation of the love of God, as a paradise of his wisdom, manifested in all his creatures down to the tiniest, and in the wonderful interrelationship between them. Man is at once a part of nature and he transcends it. In maintaining this delicate balance, he must make use of nature wisely. Man's vocation is to be in this cosmic creation, so to speak, as the eye in the body. Note that Merton is now saying all of us and everything is created by God, but notice also his recognition of our interdependence, interrelationship, and responsibility. So moving to my fourth point, how his landscape, his habitat, becomes his way of being, his habitus. So the place changes then to an attitude that informs everything that he's involved in. And I want to mention just 3 points. And these are the last 2 years of Merton's life. Book review in January of 1967, the review of Wilderness and Paradise in Christian Thought, in which he says, monks would seem to be destined by God in our time to be not only dwellers in the wilderness, but also its protectors. All right, there's the responsibility. And in a series of letters to Barbara Hubbard, who is a futurist, who wrote to Merton saying, what do you think about the future? Where are we going? He talks about the difference between millennial and ecological consciousness. And notice how he predates Pope Francis's Laudato Si and the climate change crisis that we are currently in. He says in his letter to Barbara Hubbard, humanity is poised on one of the crucial thresholds of his existence. A millennial consciousness is ready to destroy and repudiate the past so that the big event will happen. The ecological consciousness, on the other hand, says, look out, be careful what you discard. We are not alone in this thing. We belong to a community of living beings, and we owe our fellow members in this community the respect and honor due to them. And then just before Merton's death in December of '68, that summer, he publishes a review of Roderick Nash's book, Wilderness and the American Mind, in which, among other things, he talks about the problem of ecology that exists in its most acute form today. The danger of fallout and atomic waste is only one of the more spectacular ones. And then he moves to Aldo Leopold, who is responsible for writing an essay called The Land Ethic, which has become the basis of all of the United States ecological laws. And he says, can Aldo Leopold's ecological conscience become effective in America today? And he leaves it with that question. So where are we? The power of contemplation in Merton's life. It's not merely a move from prayer to social or eco-justice. Contemplation and prayer always underpins everything that Merton was doing and writing. We know you can't give what you don't have, and his commitment to contemplation made him a very effective writer and prayer. So we have Merton's writing always in the light of his ongoing commitment to contemplation. And let me turn that around a little bit, his commitment to ongoing contemplation. This is the guy who writes, everything I touch is turned into prayer. Where the sky is my prayer, the birds are my prayer, the wind in the trees is my prayer, for God is all in all. And I think that's a challenge to us, that we need to take time to be, to allow God through nature to reveal God's self to us and call us to new levels of activism, to be healers of the planet and healers of each other. Pope Francis in Laudato Si has called for integral ecology. And I think Merton would support this because his prayer and his widening vision taught him how everything in the universe is interdependent. And we'll give Merton the very last words here. At the beginning of New Seeds of Contemplation, Merton reminds us, contemplation is life itself, fully awake, fully active, fully aware that it is alive. It is spiritual wonder. It is spontaneous awe at the sacredness of life, of being. It is gratitude for life, for awareness, and for being. And with Merton's words, I will say thank you so much for listening today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weis. That is a wonderful presentation with lots for us to think about. And we'll come back to that in the question period. And now let's turn to Dr. Michael Higgins. I will leave the floor to you, Dr. Higgins.
Thank you. And thanks, Monica. What Monica has done, I think, quite nicely is to underscore the multivalent meanings or resonances of the term contemplation in Merton's life. So what I'm going to do is build on some of the things that she's already nicely organized and take us in some complementary directions. All right, what did Merton understand contemplation to mean? How did that term shift? And how did his life as a contemplative take on different variations in an altering world? Okay, so here we go. Initially, the life of a monk necessitates not only a withdrawal from the world, but a concomitant spurning of the world's claim on that monk's sympathies. Such a world-hating attitude can easily lead the monk to see the contemplative calling as the most exalted of human endeavors, with its very clear and righteous repudiation of the allurements of all that flesh can offer, and then some. You got to consider that when Merton first becomes a monk, he doesn't become just a regular or conventional monk. He leaves the literary and prestigious environment of Columbia in the late 1930s, early 1940s. He rejects that. He rejects life in New York. And what he does is he accepts life in a community of monks who are members of an order that is a reform of a already austere order. So he joins the Cistercians of the Strict Observance, a 17th century French foundation created by the abbot Armand de Rancé in La Trappe in France. So, I mean, it's quite extreme. This is a very radical turning against the world and all that it offers, to accept a world utterly unlike everything that he has previously known. It's a form of contemplative life as rejection. Although in his early years as a monk, Merton shared this view, this contemptus mundi, it never had a complete hold on him. Eventually, after years of meditation and spiritual growth, he came to see the contemplative life as a dependence on God, a dependence organized in such a way that God is both the nexus and the guiding spirit of the individual's life. It is possible, Merton concluded, to be a contemplative outside the cloister. And here's what he says. What is called the contemplative life is really a life arranged in such a way that a person can more easily and more simply and more naturally live in an awareness of direct dependence on God, almost with the sense of realizing consciously at every moment how much we depend on God and receive from God directly everything that comes to us as pure gift, and experience, taste in our hearts the love of God in this gift, the delicacy and the personal attention of God to us in God's own merciful love, which Sainte Thérèse de Lisieux brought out so beautifully in her own writing and life. Now, this is the first of three meanings I think Merton attached to contemplation. That is the spiritual vocational. But contemplation, in its second meaning for Merton, is nothing less than the remaining guarantor of human freedom. And this is where it has a special relevance for our tremulous time. The free person, Merton would argue, the genuine contemplative, is in harmony with the order of creation. This underscores some of the things that Monica was saying. Undeceived by public whim, alert to the real threats to civilized society. With Merton's contemporary, the French Catholic existentialist Gabriel Marcel, Merton would agree that, and I quote, a civilization in which technical progress is tending to emancipate itself more and more from speculative knowledge, and finally to question the traditional rights of speculative knowledge. A civilization which, one may say, finally denies the place of contemplation and shuts out the very possibility of contemplation. Such a civilization, I say, sets us inevitably on the road toward a philosophy which is not so much a love of wisdom as a hatred of wisdom. End of quote. Contemplation, then, seen as the guarantor of human freedom, is not just a metaphysical proposition. It is a political one as well. Indeed, for Merton, contemplation became his only real political article of faith. Never an ideologue by temperament and continually suspicious of all political platforms, Merton discovered in contemplation the only remaining measure that could secure human freedom in an environment of unsympathetic and destructive forces. Even in the peak years of his political awakening, the 1960s, Merton, the anarchist, the subversive voice of his one and only published novel, My Argument with the Gestapo, was never very far away. In 1968, Merton would go so far as to argue that the monk, the contemplative par excellence, is engaged in an activity not unlike that of the Marxist revolutionary. Though he stands in judgment like the Marxist on the alienating forces of society, the monk is loath to use those means, guerrilla warfare, sabotage, kidnappings, murder, that are too common a feature of revolutionary resistance. The monk rather seeks liberation from the restrictive and archaic structures of society in order to liberate people from their own self-oppression. As he remarked in his final public address, delivered only hours before his death, Marxism and Monastic Perspectives, he said, "The monk has attained, or is about to attain, or seeks to attain full realization. The monk dwells in the center of society as one who has attained realization. The monk knows the score, has come to experience the ground of his own being in such a way he knows the secret of liberation and can somehow or other communicate this to others." End of quote. It is important to note that at the time he spoke the above, he preferred to speak of the contemplative monk as the one who dwells in the center of society, no longer on the periphery, no longer the sentinel or marginal person, as was the case in the 1940s and 1950s. The contemplative is now at the very heart of society as witness to freedom's possibility. Now, this is a very important shift. We've been talking about shifts. Monica was talking about turnings. This is a significant turning. When he first becomes a monk, he sees the monk largely as a sentinel on the horizon, looking at the dark and barbarous times from within the safe enclave of the cloister, a kind of modern Benedict living in the ruins of the Roman Empire. By the time it comes to the 1950s, and particularly that time at 4th and Walnut, when he has this special mystical epiphany, when he suddenly discovers that really all the differences between his monastic vocation and the rest of the world is in fact an artifice, it's specious, that he actually loves these people. And he has this expansive sense of engagement, if you like, with them, even though he doesn't know them, okay? I think that this is a very important moment, because then you have another shift in his understanding of what it means to be the contemplative. He's no longer on the he's no longer way out there as a sentinel, okay? He's now at the margins trying to seek entry into that world. And in the 1960s, he does precisely that. He moves to this monk, contemplative moves to the center of society. The contemplative's third, or contemplation's third meaning, in my view, in the thought and life of Thomas Merton, consists of the means of recovering silence, the final assurance of artistic and spiritual openness. Although it is often cast as art's formidable rival in the arena of perfection, contemplation is vital for artistic integrity. In the words of the composer R. Murray Schafer, contemplation is an object, a reality that teaches us to regard silence as both a positive and felicitous state in itself, as the great and beautiful backdrop over which our actions are sketched and without which they would be incomprehensible. Indeed, could not even exist. So contemplation is linked also to silence. Silence feeds it. Silence is the soil on which it grows, right? The secession of language isn't only what silence is about. Silence is itself a language. It's a mode of communication. So silence and contemplation. Contemplation as witness to a world that no longer is to be repudiated, but is to be embraced. And contemplation seen in a very fundamental way as a means of ensuring our fundamental freedom. Now, you take all of this and you put it in the context of post-Trumpian political geopolitics, and you have a pretty good idea that Merton's writing now has a more intense moral urgency than perhaps even at the time of his death, which was already in a time of political and military dissolution in the United States because of the heightening war in Vietnam. And of course, the omnipresent reality of nuclear possibilities for destruction. So this is Merton's world. This is the backdrop to what Merton is writing in and through. What feeds him as a contemplative? How does he understand contemplation? Not just to be the private and sacred property of the monk, but to be a constituent component of the life of all of us who live in the world, enriching our humanity, deepening our humanity, and in a very important way, on the cusp of possible disintegration, actually protecting us. Okay, thank you. I think I ended a few minutes before the 15 minutes, but that's my CBC training. Ordinarily, I don't. Usually, I well exceed 15 minutes and can't be contained, but I'm operating in the media world now, and I work within the limits. Okay, I'm done. That's it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Higgins. Yes, I was about to punch in the time warning, but you're well ahead of me. So thank you. You've given us a lot to think about, and certainly you've extended some of the discussions which Dr. Weis has presented. So I will now turn the floor over to Dr. Pyati. I'm sure that the discussion will widen and deepen even further.
Great, thanks, Dave. Thank you to the Thomas Merton Society for hosting this event, and for the Contemplative Studies Collective, especially Dave Chang for spearheading this, and Charles Hisung. So thanks for having me and all of us here. Coming to this panel, I realized in my bio I didn't really talk so much about my connection to Merton. It was very, very brief, kind of what I do in terms of my profession. I'm somebody who I wouldn't call myself a Merton expert by any means, not like my esteemed colleagues here, but I'm somebody who came to Merton about 6 years ago. I'd heard of him before, but I'd attended a contemplative studies workshop in Massachusetts at Smith College in August 2015. And one of the speakers, Daniel Barbizot, who's a leader of contemplative studies, contemplative education, pedagogy, however we call it, had a presentation, and he had this particular quote from Contemplation, the World of Action, which I'm going to read quickly here. It says, many of you are probably familiar with this: anyone who attempts to act and do things for others or for the world without deepening self-understanding, freedom, integrity, and capacity to love will not have anything to give to others. He will communicate to them nothing but the contagion of his own obsessions, aggressiveness, ego-centered ambitions, delusions about ends and means, doctrinaire prejudices, and ideas. This is kind of a sort of this wow, kind of aha moment for me at this time when I was kind of getting into contemplative studies. And to give a bit of background, I'm an information and media studies faculty member, and I've had a background in kind of critical social theory, and I've always kind of looked at things from kind of the outside in, how to, from the more sort of Frankfurt School Marxist approach of how can we change the world through various social structures, changing political ideologies, etc. But there's a part of me as well that's a contemplative. I'm a student of yoga. I'm a yoga teacher, meditation teacher. And so that's been with me from a young age, but in the last decade or so, I did a yoga training. I started teaching yoga and meditation to my fellow first faculty colleagues and then to students at the University of Western Ontario. And so at this point around 2015, I started feeling this dissonance. There's this part of me that really kind of wants to find the contemplative in me. I didn't know the language at the time, kind of wanted to merge the idea of kind of changing the structures of the world into a more just and humane place. But then the big gap that I would see in the discussions with my colleagues who are into critical theory and are really, really kind of like the very kind of anti-establishment or kind of very revolutionary kinds of ideas that they're espousing, which I was on board with, but I was feeling that there's the soul is missing. Something's missing about actually changing our hearts and our minds. And the thought of, how can we merge this? How can we work on ourselves? I don't mean this in a narcissistic way or in a solipsistic way, but how do we do that work of cleansing, becoming more aware and conscious with the kinds of social change that many of us in the academy would like to see, and in a wider society as well. So that's what led me to Merton. That was a quote that stuck with me, and it was this interesting link between the small world, the microcosm, I'll call it, and the macrocosm, the larger world out there, where they call it society, or spiritually the cosmos. But I'll talk about society. Leave it at that for now. And so I came across, as I started getting interested in Merton, I started reading a lot more voraciously about Merton, and I started incorporating some of his ideas into my own work in terms of looking at social change vis-a-vis media, information, etc. I've a few readings that I won't talk about. You can look at my website if you want to see things that I've used Merton in, and I continue to learn. I feel I'm just a student. I'm kind of a bit of an infant / toddler. I have a toddler of my own, so am I kind of infant, toddler? I don't know in terms of Merton, of understanding him. But in today's talk, the time I have left, I kind of want to link Merton with the yoga world that I'm also familiar with. And there's some of you may know this article from Commonweal on June 3rd, 1966, called "Is the World a Problem? Ambiguities in the Secular." And I love this article, and I'm just going to bring out a few quotes here and maybe comment on them and kind of see kind of where that leads in terms of how that links to the world of yoga. So let me just bring that up here in 1 second. We'll have some quotes here actually. He says in this piece, "I am the world just as you are. Where am I going to look for the world, first of all, if not in myself?" And that to me is also a very profound quote. The idea of the world inside me also reflecting the world outside. And that got me thinking that, hey, you know what, in many Eastern philosophies, and I know yoga and Vedanta the best in terms of these philosophies, a central tenet is the idea of the microcosm being linked to the macrocosm. What's inside of me is also outside of me. And there's a profound quote there in this piece about the Vietnam War. I'm going to read that really quickly. That's what I wanted to actually get on the computer. Okay. He's talking about the fact that, I was born in 1915, I'm paraphrasing, in the contemporary of Auschwitz, Hiroshima, Vietnam, and the Watts riots. And finally, in this one paragraph here, he says, "In the last analysis, there's a secret war in Vietnam because nobody trusts anybody. This is in part because I myself am defensive, suspicious, untrusting, and intent on making other people conform themselves to my particular brand of death wish." Right? And I have quoted this in talks to my own colleagues at my university, and there's sometimes been kind of silence, right? And I have opened up these discussions about how we talk about the world out there being a problem, but how do we not start seeing the problem within ourselves, right? The very first quote I talked about from Contemplation, a World of Action, hints at that, right? Whatever I don't examine, it sounds very depth psychology-esque as well, right? Whatever I don't examine inside me will be projected into the world, right? He doesn't use the word psychology. Jung famously said, I'm paraphrasing here, what I don't deal with in my life, right, turns up outside as fate. right? Whatever sort of unresolved seems to kind of happen to me, right? So there's a very kind of mystical, right, understanding too of this, that Merton, the great, contemplative mystic that he was, is communicating to us that these worlds are clearly not separate, right? So if I'm a part of this world, as he was at that time, we're in the world that we're a part of, right, with the chaos and crisis that we're all facing, we're here, we're in it, right? We're here in it for a reason. Our karma, to use a yoga Eastern term is tied up, right, with the karma of the world. And a few quotes here. He says, the world is a problem insofar as everybody in it is a problem to himself. The world as pure object is something that is not there. We and our world interpenetrate. It is only in assuming full responsibility for our world, for our lives, and for ourselves that we can be said to live really for God. And he remarks further on in this essay, it is talking about the world out there, outside of us. It is an extension and projection of ourselves and of our lives. The word projection, right? Interesting. The way to find the real world, quote unquote, is not merely to measure and observe what is outside us, but to discover our own inner ground. For that is where the world is, first of all, in my deepest self. Amazing. A few more quotes here, and I'll move on. Talking about the world again, this world, right? It is a living and self-creating mystery of which I am myself a part, to which I am myself my own unique doer. This is the beauty of Merton, right? So many, you just read it. This is a small essay, and just these quotes, these gems, right, that are there. Another one that I found quite amazing. When I find the world in my own ground, it is impossible for me to be alienated by it. Right? Alienation is a huge theme. Both I think Monica and Michael were talking about it to some degree, right? That for whether from Marxist sense or from just a kind of existential sense, it's something he was very much concerned with, right? But the very fact is, if I find the world in my own ground, how can I be alienated by the world, right? The world itself is no problem, but we are a problem to ourselves because we are alienated from ourselves. So how am I with time, Dave? Am I okay? I want to make a segue here.
You have 5 minutes left.
Okay, about 5 minutes. Okay, good. Okay, so that's what I'm in terms of the kind of the inner and the outer world being related in Merton's work. And just one small essay I'm looking at, right? It's a very small sample size, but I think it gives us a lot to think about and reflect on. In the context of yoga, and I have very little time to kind of expound on this. We can talk about it later in the Q&A or offline. In the West, we think of it generally in kind of this physical sense, what's called asana in Sanskrit. But it's as many of you may know, right? It's a very deep philosophical mode of inquiry, philosophical school in India. And one way we can think of yoga, one way it's described as union, right? Union between the self and the divine, body, breath, and mind and spirit, or the small s self and the divine self, or the however you want to call it, the great self. And what I find interesting too is connecting Merton with this thinking is that in the context of yoga, all of life again is also happening within inside of us. We think of the chakra system, some of you may be familiar with. I was part of the PhD defense on Thursday, in which we were talking a little bit about this, right? Where the chakra system is related to the elements. Each chakra has an elemental relationship, right? So the very elements that exist outside in the world also exist within us. And one thing that I've been studying, and in this sabbatical that I'm on, just sort of on my own, on the side, as it relates to yoga and Indian spirituality in general, is also the idea of Indian astrology, what's called Jyotish. Now, I'm not asking others to say, believe in this, or whether or not want to believe in astrology or not, but it isn't a very important part of the Indian philosophical system as well. And what I found fascinating studying it, and whether or not, again, one wants to, fully accept it or not, whether it's something that's valid in terms of form of knowledge, is that the idea is whatever the planetary influences are happening in the sky are also happening within us. That if we want to say I have a particular kind of Jupiter in this particular house, right, that is aspecting a certain part that relates to my home life, or relates to my career, or to my past karma or my past incarnations, we see that affecting, that same element affects other people maybe in different ways, but that same element is there. When it's in the sky, right, the vision we have of those planets at that particular time of birth also is in my chart and is affecting my life in particular ways. And the transits of these planets, again, we can look at it as a philosophical system. Again, if we don't have to buy into it, I'm not asking to convert anybody to astrology today, but the point is that the fact is that, again, the cosmos, right, is also within me. It's another way of thinking about that, which is a connection I didn't really think about before. So the very fact is, in Indian astrology, the planets are called grahas. They're things that grasp us. They kind of grasp our attention, grasp our minds, our spirits, and they're inside us too, right? They're outside us and they're also inside us and affect us and affect our thinking and our lives, right? So the cosmos, again, exists inside us. So this is something I'm just exploring on my own. And I say, is Merton a yogi? You know, we can put different labels to him. I'm coming from a yoga perspective, maybe in a way he is. And the very fact that he was so beautifully able to understand how the world really, we are the world as well, right? We co-create the world, as Monica was alluding to. At the same time, the world is us, right? And we are the world. Right. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Ajit. Appreciate your contribution. And so we now have some time for the panelists to interact with each other. So I invite Monica, Michael, and Ajit to just comment on what each other have offered. And if the audience has any questions, I'm starting to get some questions in the chat box. You can send me the questions, and when we get to the Q&A section, I will pose the questions to the panelists. Okay, so I'll turn it over to the speakers.
Let me go
first. Because when Michael was talking about the importance of the monk dwelling in the center of society, where he attains realization and the secret of liberation, I wanted to focus on the great paradox that's there, because Merton is also saying in Conjectures of the Guilty Bystander that you must be on the edge, on the margins of society to be able to critique it. And I think it's probably his contemplation that allows for that bifocal vision. And Ajit was referring to that too with different words about the world as a mystery, but you cannot be alienated from it, that the inner and the outer worlds are related. So I would just want us to acknowledge that paradox that involves the inner and the outer, and that it's not going to happen unless there is a deep sense of contemplation.
That's right, and without beating a dead horse, it reminds me again of Blake's contraries, right? I mean, yes. How do you hold the two of them together in creating?
Without contraries, there is no.
That's right, and so that I think always speaks to what's the substratum of his thinking. How does he move forward? How does he integrate contemplation into his life? But I wanted to ask this first of all, in an act of shocking self-interest. You were referring to the letters to Barbara Hubbard from 67 to 68. Where can I access those letters, Monica? What volume are they in?
Yes, they're in Witness to Freedom.
Witness to Freedom. Okay. And the reason for that is I'm the House of Anansi Press. It's a kind of a major Canadian literary publishing house, a bit like New Directions in New York, commissioned me to write a book on Pope Francis. Well, writing a book about Pope Francis right now, yeah, get in the line, right? A week doesn't go by that a book on Francis doesn't appear somewhere in some language in the world. So I have to find a particular point of entry, a particular lens through which to look at Francis, to look at the Bergoglio legacy. And I've alighted on two ways to access Merton, to access Francis, and one of them is Merton. And partly because, of course, we know after his visit to Washington that he holds Merton in high esteem. And this particular passage that you quoted, which you argue predates Francis's Laudato Si, is a wonderful passage. So I'm going to hunt that down. So it's witness to
72 to 75.
Pages 72 to 75, and it's witness to freedom, right? Okay. Yep. Great. All right. Thank you. That's just made my day. I'm leaving now. I'm finished.
I wanted to comment on first of all, thank you. It was wonderful presentations, both Monica and Michael. Thank you. I learned a lot also just listening to you and being part of this conversation. It was interesting that Michael pointed out that Marxism and monastic perspectives was the last speech, the public talk he gave, right? And in one of the first pieces I wrote a few years ago, I thought that was, I noted it in an article, it kind of confirmed, okay, that was the last thing he said, but it's, I don't know, I've thought about maybe writing more about this. I'm not really sure where to take it, but it's very interesting to me, his relationship to Marxism. I wouldn't call myself a Marxist scholar necessarily. I'm familiar with a lot of Marxist literature, but I know a lot of people who are Marxists and Marxist scholars, and he had this kind of interesting relationship to where he was kind of attracted to the revolutionary ideas, yet it sometimes would be like, well, I'm troubled by the kind of, well, the very fact is that it's very externally focused, and maybe in a lot of ways there's a kind of the teleology can be viewed in a very Christian way as well. But he still is very drawn to the fact that he talked about Herbert Marcuse, who I did some of my PhD thesis work on. I drew on some of Marcuse's work for my thesis many years ago, and it's interesting to me that kind of that was this dangling thread, right? That the last thing he said, right? The kind of the revolutionary potential of the monk, right? And maybe the monk is doing it in a different way than the Marxist, but perhaps the aims are similar. It's just intriguing to me. I don't know, have people really, has there been much scholarship on kind of looking at Merton and Marxism, or maybe even looking at kind of interesting kind of how his last public talk, like what's kind of the symbolism of that, before his premature demise?
Well, it wasn't his it was his last talk. I mean,
his last talk,
it was published posthumously, of course.
Yes.
And he would have undoubtedly, as he always did, refine and polish the journals before publication. Right. But that wasn't an option here. His last words were really as recorded. Anyway. Right. Go now and get a Coke. So he's really back into the commercial American world, right? I mean, you can't find a more perfect example or emblem of American success than Coke. But that's pure irony. The Merton's interests in politics really, in some ways, predate his monastic life, but the monastic life becomes an important way in which it's matured. It's distilled, it's put in a larger context. I mean, we have some evidence that he flirted with communism in the 1930s, just simply flirted with, as any intellectual would have at the time. He was deeply suspicious of any kind of overarching political structure, and my argument with the Gestapo, which was published just after his death, but which he approved for publication and reviewed, is a good way of entry into his attitude around hegemonic political structures that force people to conform. I mean, it's not a perfectly crafted novel, but it's a very interesting point of entry into his political awareness and consciousness. And the fact that he would have approved it for publication in the end of his life, when it was clearly very much a work of youth, would seem to indicate that some of its themes must have continued to resonate with him. And one of them, I think, Ajit, would have been his opposition to the natural alienating power of political structures. And that's why, yes, he has some sympathy for Marxism, because he sees the subversive attempting to break out of the political structures of alienation. But at the same time, he realizes the limitations of such a strategy or ideology and falls back on the Christian understanding of alienation and consciousness from a perspective that is very unlike in terms of its political agenda. But there would have been political sympathy. And if you look through his writing, he remains a pretty strong arch critic of the political, social, and economic realities of the United States. I would never say that he took a strictly purist Marxist line or even democratic socialist line, but he is continuously critical of the primary threads of the American social, political, and economic life. Would you agree, Monica? Or?
Yes, yeah. And then also in his last speech there, we're talking, another point that comes out is about we have to return to a unity, not a previous unity or a new unity, but the unity that we already are. We are already one. So there was this other sense of him as a revolutionary talking about the importance of love and unity.
Right.
Yeah. You may as well open it up, David, to the rest of us now, because we only have half an hour. There may be a number of questions that could prompt us to respond at some length.
Yes. Right. So thank you very much. We have a number of questions. The first question is for Michael Higgins. Am I mistaken that the training of theology students places precious little importance on the role of contemplation? And if this is the case, what will keep church Christianity, quote unquote, from shriveling on the vine? That message is from Bob.
That's a good question. I wonder if you actually mean seminarians rather than theology students. Theology students cover a wide range, depending upon their program and their area of specialization and whatnot. They could or could not alight on contemplation or ascetical theology, what we we always now call under the rubric of spirituality. It would be difficult, I would think, to get through a graduate degree in theology and not be in some way affected by or touched by studies under that rubric of spirituality. Seminarians are a different species, and that's where it becomes problematic. There is a interview with Henry Nouwen, who was a disciple of Merton's, and he commented fairly late in his life, I think maybe the late 1980s or the early 1990s, commenting on his training in the seminary, and the seminary was in Holland. And it was pre-conciliar. And he said, I kind of enjoyed my training, and that would have been training in a theologate, the training for the priesthood. He said that, but they left two things out that I didn't get in the seminary, and that they were the two most important tools that I needed for my life as a priest. One was that no one taught me how to pray. So there was nothing on contemplation and spirituality and interiority. And the second was, they didn't teach me the intimacy, how to be intimate with people, women and men, to open my affective self, to be able to accept them as they are. I wasn't talking about the erotic dimension of affection necessarily, but he was talking about the importance of intimacy. So the two key pillars of that one would need for effective pastoral ministry were missing in the seminary curriculum. Now, people might argue, well, that was the 1950s, it's pre-conciliar. There's not a great deal of evidence in my experience that curriculum has changed significantly, at least in Roman Catholic seminaries, in our current period. I still don't think they're trained and taught how to pray and how to be contemplative. And as regards to intimacy and understanding their sexuality, I think they are no further ahead than they were in the 1950s. I could be wrong on this, and I would be happy to be corrected. And if you could provide me with examples where that's true, I jump on it and even write an article about it. But I think to leave out contemplation in the shaping of anyone, whether their theological vocation is going to take them into the academy, or whether it's going to take them onto the streets in social activism, or whether it's going to take them into the parish parlor in terms of pastoral ministry, is an indispensable dimension of their work and their witness. So if it's lacking, it's got to be put in, I think, urgently.
Yes, thank you very much, Michael. Yes.
If anybody else wants, my distinguished interlocutors, panelists, want to comment on that, I'm happy to.
No quarrel with you on that one, Michael. It is.
Okay, I kind of figured, Monica.
Yes, it's somewhat worrying to know that that aspect of seminary training is lacking and hasn't changed since the 50s. Okay, so the next question, and this question comes from Charles, and we have several students who are attending from the Contemplative Inquiry program at SFU, and Charles says this: Merton's work addressing the issue of alienation. Regarding the topic of alienation, which readings of Merton's would you suggest for students today who are struggling with issues of alienation? And I suppose that any of you can address this question and offer some suggestions.
We haven't worked on our handbook yet, or manual in that regard. So Ajit, it seems like a question naturally for you.
Oh gosh. The essays, I think, I can't name an essay, I'm just blanking right now from the top of my head. But I mean, essays, I mean, technological alienation is something that I've looked at more directly, and I think that maybe ask me offline. I can get the titles into my mind, but I know that themes of anything touching on, with the threats of nuclear annihilation, just technological, progress, or the cult of technology is something where alienation generally always seems to be woven into Merton's work, just so that I find just maybe doing these kinds of searches can kind of give you shorter, digestible essays to start reading. There's a particular book I have. I can get it from the shelf.
I wonder, David, while Ajit's gone there looking for the book, could you repeat the question?
Sure. So on the subject of alienation, which readings of Merton's would you suggest for students today who are struggling with issues of alienation?
Okay.
Yeah, so to give you guys a bit of background, so one of the things that I see as a university instructor is that young students today are dealing with, they don't get opportunities often enough to explore meaning in their lives, purpose and meaning. They don't have opportunities in the education system, it seems, or at least they don't have enough opportunity to do this. And I see this when I'm interacting with the students. The other thing that I notice is that when we create spaces for those conversations to happen, they are so appreciative. They love it. They're thirsting, hungering for meaning in their lives. So I was wondering which readings of Merton's, as you well know, back in the 1950s and the 40s, alienation was such a huge, post-World War II, yeah, such a huge theme, the existential philosophers playing a large role in everybody's psyche, alienation appearing in the popular press, issues around alienation, Merton dealing and addressing those issues in his writings in the 50s and 60s. So I'm just wondering which of any of his works you might think would be appreciated or helpful to students.
Well, I remember 2 years back when I had given a talk, I served an in-depth kind of discussion of learning to live from 1967, and that doesn't talk about alienation directly, but it's aimed at the university, right? And I think there's something of there's a quote of the hell of meaninglessness or something. I forget, I'm paraphrasing, but meaning comes up in and out, right? That the need to be a success, right? What does that mean to be a success? That Merton struggled with, obviously, in his life, and to be labeled with, and in this essay I read, is the world a problem, right? The fact that he's put on a pedestal after a 7-story mountain and is viewed in the public as a certain kind of contemplative genius / expert, or somebody who the public has seemed to have figured out already, right? And he says, I'm not writing to you as that person. I'm writing to you as this other person who's wrestling with these problems of how to be in this world of chaos and conflict and war, and so Yeah, I'm sorry, I just can't think of. There's a particular essay right now that I just can't think of the title of it. I don't have the book. I'm not at, as with COVID, I'm not around my books. I'm in Vancouver. I'm not in London, Ontario. So I just can't think of it's on my shelf. I can't think of it right now. But yeah, I think
there are various sources in which he addresses the issue of alienation. You're quite right, Charles. I mean, in the 1950s, late 1950s, right through the 60s, alienation was part of the philosophical argot. Everybody was talking about that, whether you were an existentialist or otherwise. And working with the theater of the absurd, it didn't really matter. And Merton did identify with this, and significantly. As Ajit was talking, again, I think of some of the possible sources you could look to, where he talks about alienation. One of them would be, oops, I just disappeared here completely. I have no idea why that happened. Right. Well, anyway,
it's sharing screen.
I've just lost my. Well, I'm okay. Let me try down here. Okay, I have no idea. Well, at least you can see me, so I'm still. Oh, there I am. I'm back again. Contemplation and the World of Action, which is a collection of essays, has one that deals specifically with final integration, his reflection on a Persian psychiatrist and his work. And that deals very specifically from a psychoanalytic point of view with the consequences of alienation. Also, Raids on the Unspeakable, collection of his literary essays, looks quite closely at the dimensions and the tone of alienation and its complex effects on human society and individuals. Just talking about the absurd. There's a piece on, of course, on Eugene Ionesco there. And it's New Seeds of Contemplation also addresses the tone of alienation on our culture and our time. If I were working with a group of students and wanted to alight on alienation, however, and the quest for meaning and the struggle, particularly in the context of the hegemony of technology, the rise of totalitarianism, I think you would be very well served by using Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. I think it's a wonderful journal, and he just hops along with various thoughts and connects many of them and creates a wonderful web of reflection. But just responding to your question, just off the top of my head, those are the sources I would go to, the Merton sources I would go to.
Yep, and I would reinforce that with New Seeds of Contemplation, that personal alienation, especially chapter 5, in which he's talking about the self, and the small s self, and then the true self.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah, true self. Yeah, the false self. I think New Seeds of the Contemplation of the World of Action is always a classic. I mean, whether the essay itself or the whole collection.
The volume,
yeah, the whole volume. That's.
But if you're talking about alienation within society rather than personal alienation, the Passion for Peace essays in that collection may give you that sense of technology and indigenous groups and nuclear proliferation, essays on that. But those are social justice themes.
That's right. If you want to look at it in terms of political alienation, an early work, or relatively early work, is his play, The Tower of Babel, from the mid-1950s, that appeared originally in the Strange Islands, in which he looks at the consequences of political alienation by the erosion of the power of the word. It is perhaps the most telling work, most apposite in post-Trumpian US society. Because in the play, Merton looks very closely at the destructive power of rhetoric and language that is disengaged from truth. Truth doesn't matter. Truth is inconsequential. What matters is control and power. And although he's in a tradition of verse writing, Christopher Fry would have been Archibald MacLeish, others were doing these kinds of things immediate post-war. Merton's examination of the erosion of language's power to communicate truth, or the proximity of truth, or the appropriation of truth, even its provisionality. I don't think he's more eloquent in any other writing than he is in this relatively neglected verse play, radio play called The Tower of Babel. Whether it works or not as a play is one thing. It certainly works in the way in which it addresses the political alienation, human alienation, social alienation that comes when you usurp, subvert, sunder, whatever, destroy language, disconnect the word from truth. And you can see as a consequence of 4 years of an appalling presidency that one of the greatest collateral damages is the erosion of language. Now, it's not entirely the result of Trump's immense and inane ineptitude. He actually is the apotheosis of a trend that's been existing for some time. And it may be, and this is where Ajit might want to enter into it, it's not unconnected, although he wouldn't necessarily know this, it's not unconnected with the power of deconstructionist thinking. You know, when you uncouple even the possibility of knowing truth, even in a minimal way, and deny its ontology, eventually you end up with creating your own world, and you end up creating competing worlds. And in that competition, you end up, as Trump understood brilliantly, you have winners and losers. Okay? That's the final option. That seems to be, if Merton were alive now, I would love to read his critiques. Not only of what President Trump achieved during his presidency, but what he built on. Like, he didn't come out of nowhere, right?
Right. I'm gonna let Ajit address that, because I think maybe he has something to say in relation to your comments. But there is also a question posed specifically to Ajit here. Ajit, please comment briefly on Merton's Asian journey at the end of his life, and to what extent do you see Merton integrating Eastern cosmologies and practices into his contemplative life?
Great. Yeah, thanks. Great question. Yeah, that's what's kind of struck with me with Merton as well. This kind of very broad-minded approach to contemplation, and all this kind of an admiration and sort of a seeing himself in other contemplatives who were of his tradition. I think with Thich Nhat Hanh, there's a strong bond. With others he met, other Tibetan masters he met during his journeys in Asia. Right, he died in Bangkok anyway, so he was that was the final leg of his of his physical life in the world in Asia. And so I find Merton obviously profound in what he said, but also in terms of just how his life kind of encapsulates so many different trends that I think are still highly relevant today. Right, we talk about alienation. But also this blending of Eastern and Western spirituality, that at least this ability to communicate across spiritual traditions, right? That I think Merton was somebody who was really a pioneer in the particular, and coming from where he was coming to see the monks in Asia being akin to him, right? In fact, that they share. I'm paraphrasing the quotes, that they share more in common. He shares more in common with them in a certain way than he shares with maybe others in his society, up to a point, right? So I've read some critiques. I know Judith Simmer Brown, who is, some of you may know, she's at Naropa University, the Buddhist, more Tibetan Buddhist lineage university in Boulder, Colorado, and I met her at a conference, and she has written something in a Buddhist journal that she shared with me, where she felt that Merton was somewhat of an Orientalist in terms of how he approached Asia and Asian spirituality, where there was something kind of a little bit more acquisitive about it. They kind of wanted to kind of take. I'm not an expert on this. I can't speak to that. I mean, Judith can speak to it better than I can, but I think that can be debated. But she said that, at least in this essay, that later on, he did kind of accept that these are certain traditions that he may not have access to, right? That he's trained in a certain way, and that he can respect the fact that they're coming to a sense of the higher reality, of the divine, of the sacred, in ways that are akin to or very similar to what he's coming to, and they can speak almost the same language or similar language, and are almost essentially the same in their experiences. Again, it's all subjective, but they see that kind of commonness there. But then again, one's tradition is one's tradition as well. That maybe learning from a Tibetan master is not something that Merton has access to. I think this is from Judith Simmer Brown. I think there's one Tibetan master who didn't give him particular teachings that he wanted to learn, right? So, but still there's great value in seeing Merton's life as a model for this kind of inter-religious, inter-spiritual dialogue, right? That's more than ever needed today too. And myself, coming as I'm an Indian American, now Canadian, born in a Hindu family, I identify primarily with my Indian, broadly speaking, Vedic tradition more and more as I get older in my life. But yet I read somebody like Merton, who I'm not a Christian, I'm not Catholic. I can read him and see and feel truth in my soul, in my bones, right? And that also got me to start reading more Catholic writers, to start looking at even more popular writers, like Father Richard Rohr. So you may know he's quite well known, right? Who also adores and venerates Merton, and others, right? The Center for Action and Contemplation is part of in Albuquerque that I've looked at other work there. So it brought me into the Catholic fold in a way that I didn't think I would, right? The cross and something I see, it would alienate me. I'd be like, some alienation, like, oh my God, I think of missionaries, I think of religious domination by Christians against a religious minority like myself, in North America at least. And Merton was a gateway to a kind of spiritual understanding that transcended any particular religious orientation. It actually gave me a deeper appreciation for mysticism and Christianity, for instance, too. So Merton's life and work to me is just an example of how somebody like me, who I wouldn't really see any values in the work, I wouldn't really see any connection to Merton before. Once I read him, I'm like, wow, I get it, right? Or at least I this really speaks to my heart, right? So it's in my life. I know that it's there, right? He's building those bridges.
Thank you very much.
Powerful tribute, thanks.
I appreciate what you said about feeling the truth of something in your bones. Appreciate that. Okay, so we have 2 questions actually, and we have 8 minutes left. I wonder if we can tackle both questions, and I'll let the panelists decide who wants to answer what, but if we could keep our answers succinct, that way we can address both questions. So one question is listed here. Contemplative activity / action is important to knowing one's own very self. However, even being this the foundation to a harmonic existence, I found this only peripedeutic for the encounter with others, only a beginning or introduction to encountering others. Otherwise, it is useless. Harmony isn't a solo note, but a perfect combination of several notes. For this end, being contemplative, not outside, but in the heart of society is very important. And the real challenge nowadays, I think, is how is this practically possible? So it's a very practical question about how to live and how to practice contemplation in the heart of society. Okay, I will turn it over to whoever wants to answer.
I'm going to give a very simple approach to that complex question because it requires a complex answer, but I'm going to say this very simply. As a sister of St. Joseph, based on my own personal prayer in the morning, all the people I meet that day have the spark of divinity within them. And I try to look them in the eye, even though we all have masks on. I was over doing grocery shopping this morning. I'm 3 hours later than you folks, so I've already put in a day's work. Doing the grocery shopping and speaking to the clerks, looking them in the eye. There is a moment, there is a spark there in which there is some sharing of something spiritual going on. They may not know it, I may not be aware of it, but it's a practice I try to have so that I'm present to them in a new way. That's a simple answer, but it's not easy to do. But Michael may have something more complex and Ajit also.
Undoubtedly, and less useful. I think that's right. I think it's the posture of awareness. that Monica was talking about, beautifully crafted around prayer itself. I also think it's a disposition. It's a way of being in the world that is critical. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean that in the way that one scrutinizes what runs as the prevailing orthodoxy, whether it be in church circles or whether it be in the academy, whether it be in the corporate world or whether it be in the political world, that one realizes that for Christian contemplatives, at least, and I can only speak from within that tradition, maintain a hermeneutic of suspicion. They retain a skeptical approach to prevailing orthodoxies, at the same time with a fundamental commitment to the essential things that make us human. And again, within the Paschal experience of Jesus, that is focus, that is a Christocentric focus. That would have been Merton's focus as well, right? But it's not limited to that. There's a lovely new book by Joseph Rabb, a younger Merton scholar that both Monica and Christine and others would know, which is actually based on his dissertation, which I had the privilege to be the external for many, many years ago at the University of Toronto, in which he talks about the relationship of Merton to Suzuki. And he uses Lonergan's hermeneutic in order to bring us into a deeper awareness of what happens when you really open the heart and the imagination to your interlocutor. Because so much of interfaith and ecumenical dialogue can be nothing more than superficial, right? So Rabb's book called Opening Horizons is a wonderful example, I think, of building on the need to find in our shared contemplation one of the commonalities that puts us outside our respective creeds. Because there are going to be ways in which the creeds are going to remain irreconcilable, because they define the historical experience in which we approximate our tradition or appropriate our tradition. But there are ways outside a creed that can bring us to a deeper shared understanding, as Monica talked about, the divine spark in each one of us. So there are ways to approach this, but being a contemplative is, in a way, being a rebel in the world, not taking at easily and at face value the truths that are either subtly articulated or screamed at us.
Great. Thank you very much. And Ajit?
Yeah. I'll second what Monica mentions too. I think just kind of an awareness and openness, and that's a beautiful practice of just looking someone in the eye, right? Of being aware of the divine within someone else, right, as it is in you, right? And I think that in a lot of the Indian traditions, including yoga, there's this idea of the witness consciousness, about being able to. It's honestly even taking a step back, becoming aware, enhancing your awareness, or becoming aware of your own inner tumult, right? And also being able to understand that others are going through what they're going through as well, right? And I think there's a depth psychologist, James Hollis, who I forget who he's quoting. He was quoting another great thinker from times past that, be kind because everyone has a big problem, right? Or a big set of problems, right? We all have our problems. We all have that long bag of invisible thing, but psychically and spiritually hold us down. But what makes us human too, right? But the fact is that we're all going through our stuff. I won't use the bad word for that, but that's the fact is, so how can we be more kind and open to each other, which is hard, it's not easy. It's hard to do it to oneself, right? To practice on oneself, but then to practice with others. So.
Thank you very much. We have our last question, and I think it's actually a very good question to end on. So in the Vedic tradition, it says that the light of consciousness shines 50% in the house and 50% in the garden. Jung found inspiration from the Veda and the Gnostic Gospels as existing ancient frameworks to help guide us today with our challenges. What would you see as the essence of Merton's message that would guide us in our contemplative practice today? And because the question has to do with essence, I'm going to ask every speaker to be very concise and just sum in one sentence or so the essence of Merton's message for contemplatively minded people today?
Be awake and aware.
Compassion.
Yeah, I'd say, everything, but, love is the ground of your being, right? And that's to ground yourself in that. I think the essay said that if I realize that, if I'm grounded in that, then I really have no problems, right? I mean, I do, but I don't, right? Because I am connected.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate everyone's time. I appreciate Monica, Michael, and Ajit, who have come here to share with us some of their thoughts about Thomas Merton, who is still, I think, a very relevant figure for our time. And I thank all of you for coming here. A lovely collection of people related to the Thomas Merton Society of Canada, as well as SFU, Faculty of Education. So thank you very much. Let's give each other a virtual round of applause. And there are lots of really interesting comments in the chat box. Judith, for example, has provided some more additional comments in relation to Michael's comments. So if you want, please.
He's wrong, by the way. She's right about Protestant students. She's not right about Catholic seminarians. And it was Catholic seminarians I was talking about, and that Monica confirmed. Protestants are much better trained for the spiritual traditions than Catholics.
I see. Okay, so there's still a divide. All right.
But I wonder if you could also mention, because they're here, in addition to the Thomas Merton Society of Canada, there are many members here from the International Thomas Merton Society.
Okay.
And that they're our wonderful sister organization in the United States. So it's wonderful to see many of their faces here as well.
Yes. Welcome and thank you very much for attending. This is the miracle of Zoom. Despite its limitations, we are able to reach out across vast distances.
Michael, I just, excuse me, Dave, I just noticed a question in the chat there for you, Michael. Could you mention the title of the book that you just recently mentioned? This is from Daniela.
Yes, I don't know which, because I mentioned so many books, I don't know which book is it being alluded to. That's the problem.
Oh,
I read so many books, I don't know which one I'm supposed to repeat.
Daniela, if you want to let us know, or Daniela and Carlo there.
I think it's Joseph Robb's book, Michael.
Oh, yes. Opening New Horizons, I think, yes, I think it's Opening New Horizons. I just reviewed it for the seasonal, and I just forgotten. Is it Opening Horizons or Opening New Horizons? But it's Joseph Rabb, R-A-A-B. Okay.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you, everyone.